all for joining us today for our Navigating Housing Cost workshop. So in today's workshop, we're going to talk a bit about understanding standard housing costs and your obligations as a renter. We're going to talk about understanding what landlords look for when they are renting out apartments or homes. We'll talk a little bit about your lease and how to protect yourself as a renter or tenant, and how to prepare for the future housing search if you end up looking for a new apartment one day. We're going to start today by just clarifying today's topic area. We're going to talk about navigating housing costs related to renting a home or apartment. So renting is when you don't own the place you live, you are paying every month to the home or apartment owner. You're paying rent so that you can live there. We will have a workshop coming up next month or the month after about how to purchase a home in the US. And this usually takes a little bit more time. So just so you know, we're focusing on renting during this workshop. Okay, so let's jump into renting a home. So first, it's really important before you start renting, or when you first get your first apartment, you always want to know and plan out for what your monthly costs are going to be. When you rent a home, it's not just you're not just paying your rent cost, right? So the rent cost is the amount that you're paying to the landlord or the owner to live there. You're also going to be paying things like utilities, right? In some places you're paying for water or gas, your electric bill, internet, TV. So those are all things that you're going to want to loop into your budget. Also thinking about furniture costs, right? You're going to have to sit somewhere in your apartment and sleep somewhere. Thinking about household items like soap, toilet paper, pots and pans. Those are budget items you'll need to budget for as well. Some other things too to think about are, as far as costs, are renter's insurance and security deposit. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail about that later in the class. So just to say, in the first few months in your new apartment or home, it's a little bit more expensive, right? Because you're buying these the furnishings and things you need in the beginning to make your apartment a home for you and your family. And this is something that we try to coach everybody on, is that really in your first year or two in the US, your housing costs might be a little bit higher, right? Because you don't have, and you might be spending a larger portion of your income on your housing costs. And this is because, we'll talk about too, is that because you don't have a lot of financial history in the US, it might be more difficult to get some of those cheaper housing options. So just to say, it is expected that it might be a little bit more costly in the beginning, but over time with planning, we'll give you some tips today, you'll be able to reduce some of your housing costs in the future. So the first thing you want to do is make a budget for yourself, to think about all of these monthly costs that might come with your apartment or your home, right? So a budget is looking at all of your income or all the money that you're earning and comparing that to all of your expenses or all of the things you're spending money on every month. And so by making a budget, it'll help you plan both what income you're going to need to cover your expenses, and it also helps you decide on a price range, right? So when we're deciding on an apartment, if you look at your income first, it'll help you decide on a price range that would be doable for you and your family to afford. So when you make your budget, then after you list out all of those expenses and all of your income, then you can prioritize by the things that are most important, right? So usually that's things like your rent, right, is most important, and your food costs. But then you can look at those other things like furniture and see if there are places where you can reduce, or see if there are things you can put off maybe until next month or the month after when you have some additional funds there. So there are some tips we have for reducing some of your household expenses. And the first thing to think about are if there are any government housing assistance programs in your area. Well, government housing there's many different types, but the two main types that we usually see across the country are either government-owned housing, where they're able to offer a lower cost rent based on your income, or they have some financial assistance programs to help you pay for your housing. So if you're working with an organization, you can uh, like a nonprofit organization or something, you can talk to your caseworker, or you can go to your local social service office or local housing authority and ask to see if they have any resources for these government housing assistance programs. And another thing to think about is, are there opportunities to save on your utilities, right? Most states have energy saving programs that you can use where they have a lower cost electric bills or water bills for you and your family. And those programs are available at your social service office. There are also some really easy ways to reduce your energy bills and utility bills. For example, if you should make sure you shut the lights off when you leave your house, or shut off any devices that take up a lot of energy and electricity. So, especially with the summer months coming and air conditioning, if you have air conditioning in your unit, you're going to want to make sure that's off when you're not using it and you're not home. Otherwise, your electric bill might be really high. So, the idea is, if you're not using it, keep it turned off, because most of the time you'll get charged for either electric or gas or water when you're, whether you're actually using it or not. So, and then some last tips for some of those other household items like furniture and, those day-to-day things you're buying, like soap and paper towels. You can buy in bulk, or go to some of these stores where they have, you can pay for a membership, either you or you can have a few families get together and pay for a membership, and then you can buy things in large quantities. You can go to thrift stores and buy used items, and usually they're in pretty good condition. Or you can see if there are any places near you that offer donations for items like furniture or clothing. So now, talking about looking for an apartment or securing an apartment or home, what do landlords or owners look for? So they're going to look for a few things when you're applying for an apartment. They're going to look for income. First, they want to see what income you're earning, the money you're earning, and your ability to pay back or pay the rent on time. Some places will also ask about your family size. A lot of cities and states have rules about how many people can live in a certain amount of space. So, for example, they don't want 10 people living in a 1-bedroom apartment. And so they might ask about your family size when you're applying for a new apartment or home. They might also ask for a background check. And a background check looks at kind of your history being in the US. And similar with your credit or your credit report will look at your history of paying bills in the US and if you paid on time. And so landlords and homeowners, they don't know you, right? And so they do this as a way to learn more about you and see if they can trust you in living in their home, and trust you to pay your rent back on time. If you're new to the country, generally there won't be much on your background check, and it's likely that you won't have a credit history because you haven't really interacted with financial systems. So, that is one barrier that sometimes happens when you're looking for an apartment. And you'll see that if you don't have credit, they might ask for you to pay, a larger amount for rent up front to show that they trust you, or they might ask for additional information to kind of prove that they feel comfortable with you living there. So in addition to, those application requirements, there's going to be some specific costs that you will probably have to, you'll probably see when actually securing the apartment. So the first is that security deposit. So a security deposit is a sum of money that you are paying to the landlord or the property owner, as a way to show, as a kind of insurance for them, right? So if something were to go wrong in the apartment, like there was a lot of damage to it, or if for some reason you don't pay your rent, this security deposit is meant to be a backup so that the landlord has um, something in case something goes wrong with their tenant. They will also ask for the new tenant to pay some rent up front, or to pay a few months of rent up front. Generally, this could be 1, 2 months. It really depends on your state and your city, because there are laws and rules about how much they can charge for rent and your security deposit. But like we said, if with less credit history and lower income, you might expect to pay a little bit more in the beginning in order to secure that home. Some other things to think about are the moving costs, right? So if you're moving, you live in an apartment now and you're moving a new place, you might need to pay for a truck or a van to move all of your stuff. And then some places, they have a broker's fee, and not everywhere, but for example, in New York, if you are working with a real estate agent to find an apartment, they'll likely charge you a fee for their help in finding the apartment. So it's not the case in every city, but you'll want to check in and ask, if you're working with a real estate agent, ask them before you start working with them, so they don't charge you a fee later. So just to note that in the beginning, right, when you first arrive in the country, you might have your options for places to live might be a little bit more limited, right? Because either you have no income or lower income, no credit or rental history. But just to say that, over time, you can improve your housing options. And we'll talk about, ways you can start planning now for the future, right? You don't always have to live in the same place as well. And that's something to note, that where you live right now, you don't have to live there next year, right? If you plan financially, you might be able to get some better options for yourself and your family in the future. So now we're going to talk about some ways to protect yourself as a renter. So, you've made your budget, you've thought a little bit about your home, you're starting to plan for getting either, to cover your current housing costs or move into a new apartment. But you also want to know the things that are there to help support you and protect you as a renter or tenant. So let's start with the lease. So your lease is the legal agreement between the renter or the tenant and the landlord. And basically, when you sign this lease agreement, you are signing off on certain responsibilities when you're living in that apartment or home. So your lease is going to include, basically, it's going to include everything you need to know about living in that place, right? It's going to include your rent amount. So how much you're going to pay every month, when the money's due, and how to pay, and what will happen if you don't pay on time. It'll also include the term or the amount of time for the agreement, right? So it'll say, by signing this, you are agreeing to live here for 6 months or a year, and therefore you are saying you are going to be responsible for paying your rent for that time period. It'll also list your responsibilities living in that apartment. And the first one is to make sure you respect it and keep it taken care of, right? If you want to make any changes to the apartment, we always recommend you talk to the landlord first and get their approval, because otherwise, it might be an issue later when you're trying to move out. They might ask you to, fix everything that you did. So again, you are, by signing this, you're making an agreement. The person that signs is agreeing with the landlord to keep everything in good condition and to check in with the landlord before you make any changes. Your lease might also, for as far as responsibilities, list things like, can you have pets, or disposing of garbage, or it'll try to list, most of the time your lease will list all of those specific details so that you're aware of everything you'll need to do to maintain the apartment. The lease will also mention the landlord's responsibilities, and this is really important for you to protect you. So it tells you what the landlord's going to be, responsible for in maintaining the apartment, or if there's an issue, what they need to follow up on. Additionally, if there are any fees, it'll list it in the lease. Sometimes there's a fee, for a late rent payment, or a fee for, having a pet or something. And if there are utilities included, it will specify it usually in the lease so that you have that in writing. So as far as responsibilities with the lease, so for home maintenance and repairs, landlords are usually, or the building owner, are usually responsible for the repairs that are needed to make sure the apartment functions correctly. So like plumbing, if there's problems with the pipes, or the shower, things like that, heating, windows, doors, your locks, those are usually things the landlord will end up being responsible for fixing. So you are responsible for any, other, we call them like cosmetic repairs. So like if you decide you want to paint something, again, I would always ask first before you paint, or make any big changes to the apartment, because in the end, you might have to fix it before you move out. So I know I've had to, in many situations, if I painted a wall blue, and before I moved out, my landlord said, you paint that wall back to white, or I'm keeping some of the security deposit. So you want to make sure you don't make any like changes without talking to them. And then if there's any damage that you caused, likely you'll be responsible for fixing that. So for a lease, again, it's meant to protect you, right? In some ways, right? It's telling you exactly what you're responsible for, exactly what the landlord is responsible for. And it's also there for the landlord's benefit too, right? To protect them in case something goes wrong. So the number one thing that we recommend always is, please read your lease. Make sure you are reading the whole thing and you understand all of the terms before you sign it. Because again, once you sign it, it is your responsibility to take care of that apartment, and it's your responsibility to pay the rent and meet all those lease terms. So here are some common questions about the lease that we usually get. So first, what happens when your lease ends, right? So it's a term. So it might say, you're coming close to the end of a year of your lease. And so you have a few options. You can either stay, right? If you like that apartment, you can stay and ask to sign a new lease. And in that situation, just know that your rent could change. The landlord can decide to change your rent. You can also give notice and move out, right? So usually in your lease, it'll tell you that how much notice or how soon in advance you need to tell your landlord if you plan to leave, right? And if it's at the end of your lease, it's usually, about 30 to 60 days. You have to tell them, I'm going to leave. I'm not going to live here anymore. And that's so that they can plan for potentially a new person to come in. Other option that could happen is a month-to-month arrangement, meaning you didn't sign a new lease with a set term, but your landlord might say, well, you can keep living here, and you'll pay your rent every month. The issue with this is, one, they can change your rent amount anytime, right? And two, they could decide in 2 months that they actually want to rent it to somebody else, and they'll give you some notice, but it doesn't really protect you as much as a lease would. Having that lease means that you are basically guaranteed to live there at that rent price for the time of the lease. Now, what happens if you want to leave your apartment before the end of your lease? So this is usually called breaking your lease agreement. And so the first thing is to check what it says in that document, because there is usually an area that will say what will happen if you decide to leave early. So there's many different penalties that could come up. So one, your lease could say that you have to give a certain amount of notice, right? It might say if you want to leave, you have to tell your landlord or give the owner at least 60 days notice to let them know that you're leaving. It's also possible that they might say that they're going to keep your security deposit if you leave early. And then, I've also seen on leases, and we've seen on leases where they might say, you're always going to be responsible for paying your rent for that whole time period. So again, before you sign your lease, make sure you check what the terms say. And then if you do decide to leave, make sure you're checking to see what the penalties would be, because sometimes you might be responsible for paying all of that rent. And then it might not be the best decision to leave at that time. So there are some ways around this, like if the conditions of the apartment are really bad, but in any case, you'd want to talk to a housing attorney or someone, get some legal advice if that's the situation and you want to leave. In the case that like you want to leave your apartment because let's say, it's falling apart, nothing works, none of the water works, it has no heat. The first thing you'd want to do is report it to the local housing authority, and then potentially see they have housing attorneys and people that can give housing advice to see if breaking the lease is going to be possible in those situations. So what happens if you don't pay your rent? So again, you did sign a legal agreement on your lease saying that you are responsible for paying your rent for that whole term. So a few things could happen. You could be evicted, meaning you'll get a notice saying you need to leave that apartment. They could take you to housing court, which won't look too good if you have, and they can ask at housing court. It can go many different ways. They might require you to pay back some rent owed or pay for damages, and then it can affect your credit. It can show up on your credit report. Which would affect like your ability to take out money or potentially rent other places in the future. So just to summarize for your lease, read your lease. It's there, it gives you all the details about renting. It's there really to protect you, to protect the landlord. But again, make sure you understand the terms, because there can be repercussions if you don't follow all of the terms in the lease. And when in the end, when you're signing it, it is your responsibility to follow the terms in there. So we're going to talk a little bit now about rent increases. So the question we see sometimes is, can a landlord increase my rent? And the answer is, if you have a lease, no. So if you have a lease and it says how much you're supposed to be paying for rent, you're not supposed to change that. If you don't have a lease, they could technically change your rent, right? So that month-to-month situation, they're able to change the amount you're paying every month. So again, you want that lease is meant to protect you and lock in that cost that you'd be expected to pay every month. So if the landlord does increase your rent, like let's say the end of your lease, and they say, if you want to still live here, we're actually increasing it, which they're able to do. You can either, I would recommend doing a budget and seeing what you can afford, and then weighing if it's worth you staying there, or you might need to find somewhere else to go. And that's why it's important to talk to the landlord in advance, maybe a month or 2 months before your lease is up, just to check in and see, so you can plan if you do have to decide to move somewhere else. But if a landlord increases your rent when they're not supposed to, like in the middle of your lease, or some cities have a regulation for how much they can increase your rent, then you can also file a complaint at your local housing authority. Another thing to consider when protecting yourself as a renter is renter's insurance. So this is insurance that you pay for to protect the stuff you own from theft, vandalism, or fire, explosions, as some examples. But it's really meant to protect the things that you have in case something happens to them. So just to note, it doesn't cover everything, right? Each plan is going to say exactly what type of damages it would cover and what items it'll cover. So for example, sometimes computers, there's limited coverage depending on how much your computer's worth. And if you live in an area that has natural disasters like fires or earthquakes, you might end up paying a little bit more, or your insurance might say it doesn't cover for all of those. So again, that's something that you can shop around for and look at different plans, but you can also ask people in the city that you're living, like what insurance that they recommend. So yeah, the price is going to be different in every state, city, even your neighborhood. It could be a different price. I will say on average, they're like $14 to $15 a month for insurance, depending on how much coverage you're going to have. And again, this could be sometimes required by your landlord or the building owner. And if you don't have it, they could charge you a fee. Not everywhere requires it, but you'll want to check your lease again to see if that's a requirement. And there are many different companies that offer renters insurance, like some of these bigger names like Allstate or State Farm, but there's also some small local companies that might offer better rates. So like we said, it's good to ask around and see what people recommend for renters insurance and see what kind of coverage you'll need. So when looking at how much you should take out, so the way renters insurance works is you'll decide on a policy or how much, up to what amount you're going to cover for your items. So usually you'd just want to add up the value of the things you have that you'd like to cover. So for example, if you look around your house and you calculate and you say, oh, everything is worth, I think, $25,000, you would take out a policy that would cover up to $25,000 or a little bit more. And so that's how you would end up deciding how much the total coverage. A note though, some landlords, like we said, do require you to get this, and sometimes they require how much your coverage is. So we have seen things like a landlord in the lease saying you have to get $100,000 of coverage. And then there's a fee if you don't get that insurance. Now we're going to talk about the security deposit. So when you went to get that apartment, you paid this security deposit, right? So that the landlord feels comfortable in case something happens. He has that money to either pay for repairs or pay for rent that's owed. But the thing is, if everything goes well, you can get that money back at the end of your lease. So you're going to want to try to make sure that you keep it with all the requirements so you get your money back. So your landlord can keep that deposit for a few reasons. Like if you owe rent, you didn't pay. If they go through the apartment and they think it's not clean or there are any damages. And then if you don't return property, so if you don't return the keys, they could potentially keep the security deposit. So just some do's and don'ts to make sure you get your security deposit back. For do's, when you move in, take pictures of the apartment, right? And so that you can show what condition it was in when you moved in. If it's not in good condition, right? Like let's say there's a window broken or there's something very obviously broken. You don't have to sign the lease right away. You want to talk to the landlord and get in writing that they're going to fix that and that it's not your responsibility. Another thing is when you move out, ask for a move out inspection. Ask for someone to walk through and take a look and take any pictures to show what it looked like when you left. Because you never know, when you move out, maybe they make some changes and maybe they say something that you did a damage that you didn't do. And then lastly, when you're ready to move out, again, give notice, advance notice, tell them you're going to move out, a month or two in advance, and put it in writing so that, there's no question that you provided that proof to them. Things to keep in mind, for like, do not change the locks. Don't paint or make big changes to the apartment without getting approval, like putting holes in the wall or putting up big shelving units that might damage the wall. You want to just ask because you don't want any You don't want any reason for them not to give you back your money when your lease is over. So just some last tips for protecting yourself as a renter. Try to pay your rent if you can in person, using a money order or a cashier's check with the date on it. Or if you can, do direct deposit, right? Because those will have a date. And so regardless if you can get a receipt, that's always the best option because you want to show and prove that you're paying your rent on time, so that there's no question in the future about that. So anytime you're talking to your landlord or building manager too, you want to keep record of the conversation. So if you can send it via email, if it's a text message and save it, that's always good. And if there's anything, get it in writing. If they agree to fix something, ask them to write it down so that you have proof that they're going to fix it for you. And then another thing is a cash for keys arrangement. So sometimes a landlord might approach you and offer you some money to leave the apartment before the end of your lease. So just to say, one, you don't ever have to do that. And two, it's not, in most cases, it's probably not in your benefit to do this. So, if your landlord is trying to make you do this or is like pushing you to leave and trying to give you cash to leave, you're going to want to talk to like a housing attorney or someone locally to get some advice there. Another thing that we see is something called a lease purchase agreement. Basically, this is renting to own. So sometimes the landlord might say, here's an agreement and the renter paying is going to go towards maybe owning this apartment one day. And overall, unless you have a really good like real estate attorney reading through that contract and supporting you in that, oftentimes we've seen these as being a scam or resulting in you not actually being able to own the apartment in the end. So overall, we're just like try to avoid these. Or if someone approaches you about this, try to get some professional legal advice before signing anything. So, just to say, in most situations, it's probably in your best interest to ask for a lease so that it's very clear, what your responsibility is, how much you're going to pay is locked in, and that there are protections for you in case things end up differently. So now we're just going to talk briefly about preparing for future housing search. So like we mentioned, either maybe you're living somewhere temporarily right now, or you're living someplace, but in the future, you'd like to think about living somewhere else. So we're going to talk about a few things to think about and to start planning for. So the first thing to think about is, where do I look for an apartment? So the first thing, you want to figure out some neighborhoods, right? Go walk around. Go to some places that you might be interested in living, and ask friends and family for some advice there on where it might be a good place to live. So then look at some apartments, get a better idea of what maybe the costs are or what the apartments look like in the areas you're thinking of. You can look online. There's a lot of different apartment search websites. There's postings in newspapers. You can look around for rent signs. Another good place is looking at schools and community centers. Sometimes they have posting boards with available places to rent. And then there are some other resources, there's social media and Facebook, but you're going to want to be careful with these because there's a lot of fake posts. So just for these fake or scam listings, sometimes they'll take pictures from real places and copy them and post them online. And usually if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is, right? So if you see something like $1,000 for a 4-bedroom apartment on the water, it's probably not real. And oftentimes what they'll do is they'll either ask for your personal information right away. And so you never want to give out, your address, any financial information, social security right away. That's a big sign that it's not real. And if they pressure you, right, if they're pressuring you to send them money right away to get a deal before you even see the place, probably a scam. So, you know, you'll want to be careful and like doing more research and just looking. You'll start being able to tell what looks like a real posting versus what's probably fake. So some things to look for, again, do that budget. Figure out what your price range is. You might want to also consider if you have children, look at some of the schools in the neighborhood. If there's anything really specific that you need, like amenities in the neighborhood or in the building, do some research there. Ask friends and neighbors in the area. And you can even ask people that live, if you're looking at a specific building or apartment, you can ask people that live there. You can ask if how the landlord is, if they've evicted people, are they good with repairs? So you can ask around and get more information because it's always good to be informed and give yourself as much time as possible to find your next place.
Before I translate, Maria, can you explain me what the amenities are?
Yeah, amenities are like features that you want. So it could be either like in the building, like maybe you need an elevator. Maybe you have someone that has a medical issue and needs an elevator, or in the neighborhood, maybe it's really important to you that you have like a halal grocery store somewhere nearby. So you want to just check off and make a list of the things that are important to you in an apartment. So just to review quickly, we also mentioned earlier, when trying to find a home, they're going to look for income, family size, background check, and usually your credit. So these are all things that you want to start thinking about and planning for. There are also the costs for securing that apartment will be that security deposit, that rent, the moving costs, and in some cases, the broker's fee. So you want to think about that too when you're planning to move. And then, so the best advice to plan, right, for this future move, whenever it may be, is to be ready financially, right? There are some costs that are there are a lot of costs that it takes to move into a new place. And so you want to have a steady income, right? They're going to ask to see that income. So the sooner you start working and you can show that you have a work history, the better for you. Make a budget and know how much everything is going to cost for you. You can start building credit as well. And we do have some classes to talk about credit and how to do that. And then lastly, start saving. Any amount you can put aside for that eventual move will help you in the future, right? We recommend, if you can, put aside about 2 to 3 months of rent, or make that a goal to create a housing fund where you're saving 2 to 3 months so that you can pay for those security deposits and the rental down payment. And that hopefully if you do all of this, you'll feel like you'll have a lot of options when it comes to picking what type of home or apartment you'll end up renting in the future.